All right. Hello, can everyone hear me? Fabulous. All right, this is panel two, Central Europe as Laboratories of Illiberal Connections. I am your chair, Julian Waller, and you're not going to hear much more from me. We have four wonderful papers from four wonderful people. We are going to go in order. So first it is Lorena Dracula, How the West Ignites, Lessons from Croatia and Serbia in the Illiberal International Arena. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me well? Okay. Great. So first thing that I wanted to say is that I don't know who came up with the name, but I think you fulfilled many dreams about what it means to be Central Europe and what it doesn't mean to be Central Europe, since we're talking about Croatia, Serbia, and Georgia in the end. So, but okay, yes, dreams were fulfilled. And I also wanted to start off the presentation by explaining a little bit how this paper came about. It came from my PhD research, but it's not directly part of my PhD research. So I am doing an analysis of how the meaning of illiberalism is created in Serbia and Croatia. And to do that, I was interviewing many different illiberal actors and political elites and civil society members and academics as well. And basically, from this, there in the first round of my fieldwork last year, there has been a lot of conversation about what the influence of the West was in spreading illiberal ideology. Let's call it like that. So this is basically one of the offers of how we can systematize the different influences that the West had on specifically these two countries, but I think it also relates to many others as well. Um, Okay, so maybe before I go into this, I wanted to say a little bit about Croatia and Serbia as the context, because I don't think that a lot of people know how extensive the liberal contestations there are. So, mainly in the last 15 years or so, illiberal actors have gained prominence. Now, I divide them kind of into these civil society actors and political elites, primarily different in the way that they mobilize. So, do they mobilize between regular people, or are they trying to cooperate within some kind of institutional networks? Um, there's a very different level of cooperation happening in these two levels. There's some other divides. It's, of course, a very heterogeneous group of different organizations that have divided views on many, many different issues. However, the main things that happened, we have the anti-gender movement in Croatia, which started off very strongly in 2013 with the referendum for the redefinition of marriage as a union between a man and a woman. And since then, we've had multiple projects of contesting this cultural liberalism or LGBT rights, etc. And there's this colonial element to the narrative here, of course, being like, this is something that is imposed from the West. This is something that came to us and never existed here. And then on the other hand, we have in the political actors, we have the similar situation between the two countries, because it is two center-right parties, as was argued before. So these are mainstream parties primarily. However, they do sometimes cooperate with anti-gender actors, depending on what is their interest in this moment. And of course, in Serbia, there's been a significant level of autocratization. So we can talk about this political form of illiberalism as well, and the democratic backsliding and everything that comes with that. And there has been anti-gender movements in Serbia as well, especially in the last 4 years. They have some groups have been contesting basically the law on gender equality, the law against discrimination, and the law for same-sex unions. And so this was a coalition for the natural family that was formed between different religious organizations and anti-gender actors, but it has longer roots when they contested the Pride Parade in 2011, I think. So this is a little bit of the context. And then I wanted to jump into immediately some of the lessons of this aspect of anti-gender diffusion. And I would say in post-communist Europe, because I do think that it relates to that. So many of these interviews, many of these people stress that they have basically no connections with illiberal actors in Hungary or in Poland. And I think this is very important also or interesting that I'm coming right after basically, yeah, because we were talking about what the influence of Hungary is on the US and on Latin America. And Croatia and Serbia and Hungary are bordering countries, and there's no translation happening from Hungarian to Croatian. There's almost no translation happening from Polish to Croatian, or from Polish to Serbian, or from Hungarian to Serbian. Everything that is being translated through English. So Legutko first writes a book and it's translated into English, and from English, Croatians then do translate him. There's, of course, a little bit of a more complicated story with Serbia, which I'm happy that Marko is going to talk about later, with all of the connections to Russia and how Russia is translated as well. But I'm focusing now on just this. There is a very big mediating role of the West in how these illiberal ideas are being spread, basically. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that the West sets the agenda. This is a play on the words a little bit, because one of the main transnational networks which is functioning within these countries is what we used to know as Agenda Europe. I don't know how many of you heard of this, but this was a network of around 100 political civic organizations which was trying to contest liberal values at the level of European institutions, at the level of UN, etc. Basically, they did succeed in around 18, I think it was, political campaigns. And one of the main sources that I'm using to find how they are connected, besides the interviews, is looking at what actors they mentioned or what events they mentioned, and then comparing them to the actual journalistic work that was done in who visited which conference, when, etc. What came out from this and the conversations and interviews further on was that the West sets the agenda, in the sense that Western actors and US Christian organizations are going to decide what the topics are going to be, and then the actual illiberal organizations in Croatia and Serbia are going to be the ones that are going to implement them. So I already mentioned that most of the communications is mediated by the West. And again, events such as conferences, etc., are often organized by Western sponsors, including EU right-wing parties or other basically important actors, which is connected to other things that I don't have the time to talk about. But these are just some of the organizations that the illiberal civic sector in Croatia and Serbia is connected to. So there is ideological, financial, and strategic support of anti-gender movements that's coming from the West. So as I mentioned, which topics to stress, how to frame them. This is very important, because all of the successes in both of these countries that did come about came after the strategic framing was changed to a more liberal version of it. So, and this is something that they directly copied from the US Christian right. And strategic support is also this aspect of how to use liberal institutions and procedures, for example, ordo iuris or legal battles, etc., etc. This is all something that's learned. And here are just some examples of these connections. I think this email is the most interesting one. It's a little bit hard to read, but it basically is from this Agenda Europe leaked emails that became available, I think, in 2021 or so. Where one of these illiberal actors in Croatia asks the network, does anyone have any arguments against the Istanbul Convention that I could use? Could you please send me a portfolio, basically, of how to have this campaign, etc. So a direct trace of how this diffusion is happening. And then the other important aspect of this Western role is the support of the West that comes for liberal actors such as political parties, etc., and the legitimacy that they claim from participating in liberal institutions. This is a picture of Vucic and Plenković. This is Plenković, this is Vucic, both leaders of the two respective countries at the EPP leaders meeting. This is mentioned, I briefly talk about this in the paper. I think it has space to be developed a little bit further. is how the EPP never sanctioned Serbia for democratic backsliding that was happening or that is still happening. Compared to Hungary, both countries have been hybrid regimes, I think, from the same year. And there's extensive collaboration, etc. But EPP punished Hungary and not Serbia, even though for some, I think it would be logical that it's easier to kick out a member that is only an associated member and not a member proper. That never happened, and there hasn't been any kind of sanctioning or critique coming from the party. There hasn't been any significant critique from leaders in the European Union either, or anyone in any kind of formal positions. So there's this passive aspect of the West supporting somewhat illiberal leaders. This has been termed stabilitocracies. But another aspect of it that came about in the conversations was the idea that the West was the one who placed Vucic in the position of power in the first place. And this came about multiple times. I would say this is a dominant narrative in Serbia, where many instances of Western visits or visits of Western leaders or officials to Serbia before SNS was first came in power and after that to confirm this are taken as a sign of support. And this is also what was the first picture with Vucic and Merkel. They have had a very extensive collaboration, and many place the blame specifically on Angela Merkel as being the person who is supporting Vucic in power and because of who SNS is even in the EPP, etc. And this comes to this larger problem of strategic interests trumping democratic accountability. And it is something that can be seen even now and today in this year, as there has been a lot of critique over the elections that were held last year in December 2023. And even though the elections were very problematic, after a few months, the EU did issue a statement that was saying that a lot of progress needs to be made. But soon after, they had a summit on critical raw materials. You can see a picture here where Serbia agreed to ship lithium and provide lithium supplies to the European Union, which is very crucial. And suddenly Scholz and Vucic and Macron and Vucic and everyone was again best friends, and all of the conversations about the elections were forgotten. So it's this aspect of passive support, the refusal to openly criticize, and the other aspect of active support within strategic interests of these countries. So to jump to the conclusion, the many roles of the West, it serves as an inspiration where Western conservative organizations provide the ideological frameworks and arguments. It serves in mediation. It serves in consolidation because it allows a space for these actors to connect with other actors as well and to coordinate, etc. There's legitimation because then they can say, I have been to so many different conferences in the West, and this means that I am a pro-Western actor, which is considered positive, and therefore I cannot be anti-democratic, for example. There is this aspect of cooperation when they actively pursue deals with illiberal actors. And then, as I mentioned, this aspect of passive and active support. And yeah, maybe we can go into more, thank you.
Fantastic. All right. And now we have our second paper by Alexandra Jigolievska, Illiberal Repurposing of International Cooperation, Explaining the Founding and Demise of the Polish-Hungarian Opportunistic Alliance. The floor is yours.
Yes, so today I would like to say a few words about the Polish-Hungarian Illiberal Alliance. I think that everyone that has closely followed the situation in Poland and Hungary would agree that the countries have been indeed very close over the last years. And what they shared primarily from an outsider perspective was that they have both launched a massive transformation of their legal political systems. And in this context, I would like to remind us all here that both countries governments of both countries have first captured the constitutional courts in order to be able to control the content of the constitutional jurisprudence. They have also both captured the National Council of Judiciary in order to control the nationwide judicial appointments. Outside the justice system, they have politicized civil service and staffed civil service with basically incompetent people. They have captured public media and have also meddled with electoral laws, for instance. But what is essential when speaking about Poland and Hungary is that the countries differ to a certain extent, primarily when it comes to how far did the transformations launched by, on the one hand, Fidesz in Hungary and the Law and Justice Party in Poland, how far did they really get with these transformations? So first and foremost, I think it's very crucial to underscore that in Poland, the Law and Justice Party has never had a constitutional majority. So they never had a political majority that would allow them to amend the constitution, contrary to the distribution of political power in Hungary that allowed for multiple constitutional amendments. So while substantively the reforms that were implemented in Poland in a cumulative sense, they did amount to a constitutional change, we can only speak of an informal one, de facto constitutional change that follows from the sub-constitutional law being substantively at odds with the liberal constitutional order. So the next dissimilarity that I think is very important is that in Hungary, the government managed to seize full control over all media outlets, whether public or private. In Poland, that has never taken place, and commercial media outlets have withstood the attacks and remained independent. And the last aspect, I think, is also crucial, that scholars point out to the differences between the countries with respect to the resilience and therefore the role of civil society and political opposition. So what I mean by that is, for instance, so the basic claim would be that in Poland, these actors play a much more bigger overall. And it is indeed true that the massive demonstrations that were held over the last 8 years in Poland did on several occasions manage to put pressure to the government to either withdraw or at least postpone some of the reforms. But so much for the differences. And coming back to the alliance, considering that on the one hand, these countries have shared the main political goals over the last years, but on the other hand, they still are, to a big extent, I would say, different. I think it is really worth to reflect on why this alliance, why did it, what were the reasons for it to even emerge? And so the leading scholarship, at least how I understand it when I read it, so the leading scholarship, of course, gives no clear answer, but there are several key factors that should be taken into account, and I would not go in detail about them, but I would like to kind of just point the main themes. So the first would be the historical one. So basically, there is this argument that the countries shared a lot of their history. There is this whole myth of a Polish-Hungarian brotherhood that actually has the origins even in the Middle Ages, because the countries in the 14th century, for small two periods, they entered into the so-called personal union. So they had one king, and then more modern history, of course, the experience of communism is something that's very unifying. The second argument that crops up and is kind of related to this historical one is the socioeconomic one. So both countries have undergone post-communist transformation to liberal democracy, and societies in both countries have been very disappointed with the outcomes of the transformation. So despite the overall economic growth, many large sections of societies have been disappointed. They felt left behind. They felt that they could not really participate in society, and primarily they felt exploited by the neoliberal policies. So, and the final argument is the cultural one. So they are culturally, Poland and Hungary are culturally compatible. They share attachment to religion. Although we must distinguish that the political influence of the church itself is much more, much bigger in Poland than in Hungary. So these are these three themes that appear in the literature. And in the remaining part of my presentation, I will actually try to convince you that these are, at least to me, these arguments are not entirely convincing. And I would like to offer an alternative view of this Polish-Hungarian alliance. And I would like to encourage us to look at it in a much more simplistic and straightforward manner. That is through the lens of the theory of illiberalism, through the lens of illiberalism, intrinsic, institutional, and moral goals. So the basic goals that illiberalism pursues. And I think to illustrate that, there are two very nice cases on the level of the European Union. And so the first concerns migration. And it concerns, to be more precise, it concerns the the EU's emergency plan for the relocation of refugees. So back in 2015, when the Europe for the first time faced a massive inflow of migrants, in order to unburden the countries of Southern Europe, mostly Italy and Greece, that suffered the most and that were in the worst, found themselves in the worst situation, the EU, together with the member states, elaborated this emergency distribution scheme. And it's very crucial to underscore that this scheme provided for a radical shift from the back then effective EU migration policies, because it demanded that all states accept a certain amount of refugees and that they all therefore participate in the resolving of this crisis. And so obviously Poland and Hungary refused to participate in this relocation mechanism, and their arguments were grounded, well, first in religion. So Hungary was the first one to have spoken about the need to protect the Christian civilization, and then Poland kind of adopted the same narrative, so they launched this very anti-migrant narrative. I think it is also worth mentioning that Hungary has adopted the so-called Stop Soros Act that criminalized help to the asylum seekers provided by the NGOs. By the way, it was the piece of legislation was found to violate the EU, so the ECJ ruled on that in 2021. And Hungary has also, once again, as I said, amended the constitution. And now the constitution says that an alien population cannot settle in Hungary. So that was also that was also part of this anti-migrant campaign. In Poland, on the other hand, it was really shocking how the captured public media were employed to depict refugees as terrorists, or even the claim that was made on public television by the party's leader Jarosław Kaczyński was that the refugees were the carriers of deadly diseases. So why is this an illustration of illiberalism? Well, because illiberalism typically meddles with the public perception of migrants, for instance. It taps right into the most common fears and anxieties that appear in the society. So that is why I consider, at least, that we can see and understand the backlash against migration that occurred in Hungary and Europe as an illiberal backlash. And the second case concerned conditionality mechanism. So there was it is a mechanism that links the payment of the EU funds to each and every member of the EU, that makes it contingent on the given state's rule of law performance. So following this mechanism's implementation, Hungary and Poland have lodged a claim for its annulment, obviously. Well, I think it doesn't come as a surprise when we agree that they are both leaders in terms of the number of infringement proceedings launched against them, precisely because of the rule of law violations. But one of the central arguments that they made was refer to the principle of national identity. And they argued that the definition of the rule of law varies in different countries, in different jurisdictions. And that in principle, the EU law accepts that and protects that under the principle of national identity. And therefore, there cannot be a mechanism within the EU that will assess the rule of law irregularities only with reference to one particular rule of law definition. That this didn't agree to the EU institutions deciding on which definition is binding and not binding. And once again, what is illiberal in it? It is illiberal because it is a classical example of an illiberal abuse of liberal constitutional principles. So what illiberals do is they will repurpose, take the language, as I think it was also addressed in the keynote. They will use the democratic, the liberal language, but they will repurpose it to serve their ends. So in this particular case, it was repurposed just in order to evade the financial liability for the rule of law violations. Okay, so as we can see, the cases over which Poland and Hungary united on the level of the European Union mark clear ties to the basic assumptions on illiberalism, our basic understanding of how theoretically illiberalism works. So, in consequence, that is why I think that we should primarily understand the Polish-Hungarian alliance as a consequence of the respective domestic transformations and not as a consequence of the shared history or cultural ties or religion. And I think it teaches us also one general thing about illiberalism, that illiberal governments are really willing to engage or at least pretend to engage in a serious alliance just in order to be able to more effectively implement their goals domestically. So I think we should really kind of have it always in the back of our heads when approaching illiberal governments' international actions. Thank you.
All right, excellent. Our third paper is coming from Anastasia Mugalablishvili, Illiberal Dynamics and EU Enlargement, a role of Orban's Hungary in sustaining the Georgian Dream's rule.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here, especially 2 days before very decisive elections in Georgia, which I'm going to talk about. Talking about the liberal alliances and networks that sustain the current Georgian Dream government. We started this talk with asking a very prevalent question, which is, if so many citizens are in support of democracy and supports democracy, then why do they keep voting for anti-democratic parties? And I think Georgia is an especially puzzling case in this sense, because for the past 12 years, a government that has grown increasingly liberal and authoritarian has been in power, while at the same time, the Georgian citizens are overwhelmingly pro-democratic and in favor of EU integration. And this is what I look at as a broader part of my PhD dissertation. But given that this is a conference on the liberal international, I'm going to specifically focus on how Hungary helps Georgian Dream sustain a democratic pro-EU image, because that's what Georgian Dream needs to remain in power in a public that is overwhelmingly in favor of EU integration. Specifically, I will focus on how Hungary diminished the power. How Hungary diminished the power of the European Union's conditionality. So it weakened the EU's ability to counter democratic backsliding in Georgia. And the two times that the European Union tried to apply this, apply negative conditionality against Georgia and withhold some of its valuable rewards from the Georgian government as a way of signaling to the citizens, and perhaps also pressuring the government, that Georgia had to change its trajectory in order to continue on its EU path. So I will first talk about why EU's conditionality had the potential of impacting Georgia's democratic trajectory and pressuring not only the government, but also Georgia's citizens in changing their course. And then I'll go in about what Hungary did about this. So many of you might know, but the strongest tool that the EU enlargement process had was its conditionality policy, which means that the European Union made integration into the EU conditional with a state's compliance with liberal democratic criteria. And this is the reason why many, well, this part is a bit debatable, but there's more or less a consensus that many states in Central and Eastern Europe were willing to reform their systems to more or less liberal democratic and systems that were also market economies to get this valuable benefit of becoming an EU member. But in the same sense, the European Union had a possibility of withholding this reward, and by doing so, by applying negative conditionality, it could signal to not only the government, but also the citizens that a change was necessary. And Slovakia's case in 1998 demonstrated that by withholding this reward from Slovakians not starting EU accessions with the Slovak government because of its illiberal government, made the citizens come out on the streets and also vote out their government in the 1998. So basically negative EU applying this pressure and using negative conditionality had or at least contributed in part to bringing a change in Slovakia in 1998. And a lot of literature has focused how this credibility of EU conditionality has been challenged in different ways. One is the EU having an enlargement fatigue and not wanting to enlarge anymore. So no longer giving the reward of EU membership despite states complying with EU's criteria. What Lorena recently mentioned, the stabilitocracy argument, that frequently because the European Union wanted to maintain stability in the region, it rewarded the states despite not complying with liberal democratic criteria. So all of that diminished the power of EU conditionality. But one aspect that has been less covered is how actually illiberal actors within the European Union have also diminished the effectiveness of EU conditionality and of EU being able to bring democratic change through its conditionality policy. And one of the main reasons why this is because EU enlargement fatigue, which did not, basically the EU was dormant in its policy, so not a lot of research could be done anyways on how illiberal actors challenge EU democracy promotion efforts. And yeah, there are different ways with which actually illiberal actors in the European Union have the tools with which they can challenge and contest EU democracy promotion. One is that the European Union doesn't force you to have a foreign policy that is same for every state. So you have freedom to pursue your own foreign policy. EU member states, many of you know this, have the power to veto decisions of the European Union, and with that, for example, veto a country's accession that has actually met liberal democratic criteria. And aside from that, the EU's member states, also the illiberal ones, have the power to elect commissioners, for example, in the European Union, and one per member state. So they can have one commissioner in each, in the commission. And in Hungary's case, the commissioner leading enlargement was the Hungarian one. So the one in charge of the enlargement portfolio was the Hungarian one, which actually makes this case even more interesting and very timely. So after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, EU's enlargement fatigue after many years finally ended, and the EU again renewed its enlargement policy and attempted to use it more or less as a tool with which to promote liberal democracy in its candidate states. And this represented a risk for Georgia as an illiberal candidate state, because as I mentioned previously, Georgian government retained a large part of its support by maintaining this pro-EU discourse and also following it with some actions, because before they had candidate status, they could easily comply with EU criteria without necessarily letting go of power. But now that they had this perspective of becoming an EU member, that meant that they actually had to go on with reforms to demonstrate to the citizens that they were pro-EU. So there was that challenge with the EU enlargement for Georgia, and for an illiberal member state like Hungary. Some people also in this panel talk about this, but Hungary has increasingly wanted to deprive the European Union from liberal democracy, because the European Union can sanction Hungary for liberal democratic violations, and therefore it has increasingly used alliances within the EU to keep the EU from sanctioning it, but also from trying to turn the European Union more and more into an illiberal union. So for Hungary, the potential of new liberal democratic states joining the EU represented a threat, which led to increasing cooperation between Georgia and Hungary. And unlike Ukraine and Moldova, which were more or less run by liberal democratic governments, Georgia was run by a government that was increasingly authoritarian and illiberal. So the European Union tried to apply pressure and its negative conditionality, as I call it, to force or pressure the Georgian government to change course, but also to demonstrate to its citizens that actually, if you want to be a part of the European Union, you have to change course. You have to either vote this government out or do something differently, because without it, it would be impossible. And in my paper, I looked at what Hungary did in these two instances that the EU applied negative conditionality in Georgia. And I looked at it both through an intergovernmental level, so what Orban and the Foreign Affairs Minister of Hungary did, and also what the Enlargement Commissioner that was from Hungary, but in theory representing the European Union, did, and how they weakened this pressure coming from the European Union side. The first time that the EU applied negative conditionality was when it excluded Georgia from candidate status. So it gave it to Moldova and Ukraine, but it told Georgia that basically if you want to get candidate status, these are the 12 criteria that you have to follow, that all were related to conforming to certain liberal democratic values, reforming the judiciary, releasing political prisoners, and so on. And at this time, I analyzed the Georgian government's media, which is also the most watched one in Georgia, their Facebook page, and looked at that time that the EU was exerting greatest pressure on Georgia and sending this messages that change had to be made. What did Hungary do, and what messages did Hungary send? And first of all, what's very interesting is that on the day that the European Union announced that it was excluding Georgia from candidate status, the Hungarian foreign minister went to Tbilisi, and he was actually sending messages that were completely the opposite and saying that EU has double standards and Georgia actually deserves to get candidate status. And then these messages were repeated throughout the 1.5 year from Orban and from other intergovernmental representatives of Hungary. And as you can see in these three main themes that appeared from Hungary towards Georgia was one, praise and support for Georgia. That was, as you can see, increasingly based on illiberalism and not on Georgia's. The praise was not based on Georgia being a liberal democracy, but for Georgia being able to be resilient, to uphold its traditions, and so on. Another message was that it was portraying Brussels in a negative light, and that also telling Georgia that Hungary supports it. But even more interesting is that this message also came from the enlargement commissioner that's in theory supposed to be impartial to his country's interests and is supposed to be talking as an EU representative. And basically, I compared the Association Council meeting on Georgia, where both the Borrell and the Enlargement Commissioner spoke, and the different emphasis they placed on different factors. And whereas you see that Borrell increasingly mentions that more progress should be made in Georgia, and that Georgia should comply with the EU's 12 recommendations, the thickness of the squares demonstrate that. Haley was mostly emphasizing that actually there was progress in Georgia, and most of his positive assessments were also based on Georgia's economy, connectivity, and things more unrelated to liberal democracy. And this is, I won't get into too much detail, but this is a more like detailed version of what the enlargement commissioner was emphasizing in Georgia, and the thickness of the line is how frequently it happened. So yeah, it was also mostly very positive at a time when the rest of the European Union was being negative. And the second time that the EU used this negative conditionality was very recently when Georgia passed the Foreign Agents Law, and at that time the EU came out. Georgia had already received candidate status then, but the EU came out and said that integration has been stopped temporarily, that there would be no more high official meetings with Georgian governments, and that's yeah, basically with the current government, EU integration was impossible. And here again, the only difference is that while Orban and the foreign minister had the almost same messages that actually EU had double standards, Georgia was doing great, the enlargement commissioner could no longer deport the foreign agents law, so he also was condemning it together with Borrell, and there you saw the limits of how much basically EU representatives can support illiberal regimes. Yeah, and the implications for the illiberal international of all of this is, first of all, it shows us how once a tool that was used for promoting liberal democracy and was considered the strongest democracy promotion tool in the world has now been weakened by illiberal actors within the European Union and used more as a tool with which to sustain illiberal networks. But also, I think it's also very timely policy-wise, everything that's going on in the European Union, because currently Hungary is also holding the presidency, rotating presidency of the EU Council, and he continues to speak in one voice as the European Union, even though he does not have the power to do that. And by looking at how Georgia used this, we can also draw conclusions on how other authoritarian, illiberal-leaning countries will use that towards their favor. One small thing that I forgot to mention before I conclude is that these cases of EU's negative conditionality, when going through Georgian media, the EU's criticism was barely covered. So I almost never ran into the channel posting what the EU had to say critically towards Georgia, but the Hungarian criticism was, not criticism, the opposite, was amplified. So with that, they somehow managed to, I don't know how successfully, we will I guess see with elections, but somehow managed to retain this democratic pro-EU facade.
All right, fantastic work. And now for our final paper, Marko Zilovic, In Competition for Illiberal Legitimacy, Russian, European, and American Ties of the Serbian Illiberal Right.
Floor is yours. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. So my name is Marko Zilovic, currently at the University of Belgrade, but I'm actually a GW alumni with my PhD here, so very happy to be back in this great program focusing on illiberalism. So in my paper, I conceptualized the Serbian illiberal right as consisting of the regime with illiberal origins, and so selectively using illiberal frames in the present day as well. Then also on the other hand, the sort of illiberal hardline illiberal or civil society and political parties that broadly we can think of being located to the right of the regime. And what I think is interesting and somewhat unusual about the Serbian regime is often sort of and it's understood through the prism, through analogy with, say, Viktor Orban's Hungary, is that it emphasizes in liberalism its socio-cultural appeal, so it is different than in a lot of these other perhaps better known cases of the liberal regime. So the regime is very much authoritarian, very much increasingly personalistic as well. So in that sense, it follows the liberal toolbook in regards to the political sphere, capturing media, clientelism, using the subverting the opposition in various ways, subtle ways, not through outright, usually not through outright repression. But the regime, at the same time, does not engage in the anti-immigration rhetoric. In fact, we heard about the good relations that Vucic enjoyed with Angela Merkel. Well, they were built in large part thanks to Vucic being very cooperative with Merkel's handling of the crisis in 2015 with immigration. So the regime also does not engage in sustained efforts to pursue networks policies, to politicize sort of social cultural research regarding birth control, and does not, try to it's not very in a sustained manner try to control ideologically the control the curriculum. There is no banning of gender studies from the curricula. Serbia, under Vucic, has both signed and ratified the Istanbul Convention. So in many ways, it sort of does not engage in this cultural illiberal themes that we came to expect from these kind of leaders. But then it does engage, why I still think it is an illiberal regime, because this, we also heard about it before, about this, the politics of memory, the memory wars being quite central to Eastern European illiberals. And in Serbia, for the Serbian regime, the memory politics, not necessarily of the Second World War, but specifically of the wars in the 1990s, is really essential to the sort of core legitimizing narratives of the regime. So basically, the basic story the regime tells the Serbian public all over again is that the basic premise is that we should reject this short experience that Serbia had with democracy and liberalism after the overthrow of Slobodan Milosevic in 2000, because that period when the country for approximately a decade was ruled by democratic parties is a period when they came to power through a coup orchestrated by Western intelligences. So it was illegitimate from the start. And also what these liberal parties did well in the 2000s when they were power, they impoverished the people through corrupt privatization, and they brought shame. Crucially, they brought shame on the nation by extraditing Serbian war leaders of the 1990s to the international criminal courts. And then the regime always compares this supposedly shameful period of national history with Vucic, who restored national pride by openly commemorating Serbian war victims and by rehabilitating Serbian war leaders, despite the war crimes that they are guilty of, and some would say because of the war crimes that they stand accused of. And the photo there is actually not, despite what you might think, this is not a Photoshop. This is the actual commemorative event in August. Every year, the regimes commemorates the expulsion of several 100,000 Serbs from Croatia at the end of the war in 1995. And they actually hired actors to pose as these refugees coming into Serbia to seek safety, while Vucic gives one of his. So it's a very tacky performance, but it serves to highlight the contrast between the regime that is sort of proudly Serbian and this regime in the 2000s that supposedly was ashamed of Serbia's recent history. And quite importantly for the regime's narrative, the regime claims it has done all that while bringing a period of economic prosperity to the country, which is real. It's modest, but it's real. And the regime, of course, controlling media always overstates its case. But the important, I think, ideologically, why economic prosperity, obviously, it's beneficial for a regime to have a good economic or better economic outcomes than the regime that came before it. But ideologically, it's important because it invalidates the liberal argument that was prevalent in the 1990s and 2000s. Serbia should become more culturally and politically like West in order to prosper. And he's saying, well, look, we are a proud Serb. I'm not ashamed of the wars in the 1980s, and we are building, we're building the economy. So in that sense, the cultural script is very illiberal. In international arena, in regards to this geopolitical script, the regime is very much on the fence, which I know might come as a surprise to some people, even though Serbia is the only country in Europe that has not imposed any sorts of sanctions on Russia. It's also voted repeatedly in the United Nations to condemn the Russian aggression. He has supported Zelensky's peace plan in Geneva. And importantly, it's become one of the main suppliers of arms and ammunition to the Ukrainian army fighting the Russians. So the regime always very careful about this balancing in the international politics. And that leaves open the space to the right of the regime for all these illiberal actors in civil society and politics who sort of fully endorse this illiberal script. They're anti-immigration, they're anti-LGBTQ, and they're very much hardline pro-Russian, walking around in t-shirts, D-letters, celebrating what I see is the great development in Ukraine. And this, I spend all the time in the paper sort of trying to tease out ideological differences between these two parts of the Serbian liberal rights, right? And about the relationship to each other. I think, I don't want to go into many details, but I think it's important to note, on one hand, this illiberal right, the opposition or the civil society, it disciplines the regime in terms of because it can whip up public support for some of these illiberal causes. It can whip up public support for Russia and sort of put the regime into an awkward position that it's not really living up to a lot of its illiberal propaganda. But it also helps the regime sustain this hegemony of liberal values in the civil society that ultimately is part of the regime's own legitimizing narrative too. And both of these, all of these parts of Serbian liberal right, I think, share this common language of, as they like to say, Serbian patriotism or nationalism, if you like, that has some, key, it really relates about these memory wars of the 2000s and about, very loudly defying the wars in the 1990s, the intensive, heroic, honorable, they're refusing to accept the Kosovo's independence, denying genocide in Srebrenica. This is all part of, malign agenda by the West, who are hating the Serbs because we are Orthodox or whatnot. And this patriotic language is shared from the president of the state to like the most obscure fascist group. And this patriotic language provides a vehicle for mainstreaming other liberal ideas. What the liberal sort of hardline liberal actors do is that they tack on these other liberal narratives onto these core patriotic issues shared by the regime as well. And these, because these issues are core to the regime, core concern, part of its legitimizing narrative, it finds, even though it tries a lot to network with people, political actors like Angela Merkel, Joe Biden, and so on, there are limits to that because the West, the liberal West, has a very different interpretation of the wars in Yugoslavia in 1990. And this is where they sort of reach a certain limit in how close they can get to these actors, and they find themselves pushed sort of to see the company of the illiberal items abroad. So moving on to this sort of, I would just briefly describing the logic and the details of this illiberal ties, international ties of the Serbian regime. I think conceptually, the argument I try to make is that the regime, because the regime is very careful, why is it selective in its illiberalism? It's very careful not to overstep certain red lines. It's very careful not to get into too much trouble with the West, basically. In part because of its origin in the regime of Slobodan Milosevic in the 1990s, that ended up in military conflict with the West. So they're very careful. They don't want to repeat of that. They try to be smarter, as they see it. So the regime, because it's like it seeks company mostly of the other liberal actors in power, and tends to avoid these edgier parts, as they call them, of the liberal international. The people like Donetsk rebels or Alexander Dugin. They're always sort of at the arm's length. The regime is at the arm's length with them. And also with the Western far right. far-right actors. And what I think is really interesting from the Serbian case is, despite the regime being so selectively liberal, it doesn't seem to be an obstacle for its strong relationship with these other illiberal regimes. I think the reason for that is that a lot of this international illiberal networking is driven, especially when these movements are in power, driven by authoritarian solidarity between them, and also by the opportunities for corruption, graft. And shared ideology is important, but these other things, and I think we can sometimes in the academic circles maybe overestimate the extent to which these people are driven. I'm not saying the ideas don't matter. I think that they very much do, but these other aspects provide a lot of content for their networking and cooperation. And in the paper, I do like a couple of brief vignettes, sort of trying to illustrate this argument. And one relates to the relations between Vučić's Serbia and Viktor Orban's Hungary. And recently the two governments established the Strategic Cooperation Council, and the two governments meet together, have a joint meeting every year. So the relations are really sort of close. The bilateral economic ties are growing. And a lot of these ties, or some of these ties, also provide opportunities for businessmen or businesses, especially from Hungary, who are close to Prime Minister Orban, to get flashy contracts in Serbia and to for the Hungarian economy to be present in the Serbian market. Also, the two regimes participate jointly in these mega projects, such as Belt and Road Initiative or Russian oil and gas pipelines. A lot of these contracts are actually secretive bilateral contracts, and they also, I think a lot of these projects actually do have some economic rationale for the broader public as well, but they also provide a lot of opportunities for corruption because they are done behind the closed projects also bring them together. And then in some important moments, especially when there is a mobilization against the Serbian regime protests in the streets or criticism from the EU, Hungary has been able to come to the rescue or to aid the Serbian regime, to be heard about the Georgian case, how Hungary having the EU enlargement commissioner can shield the candidate states regimes from criticism from the EU. Hungarian Minister of Foreign Affairs appeared even in the meetings, in the public rallies of the Serbian ruling regime, sometimes in the moments of political crisis, so the signaling that the regime is not isolated internationally. But despite that, the ideological transmission from Hungary to Serbia has been limited at best. I think it's nicely captured by this photo, because in his efforts to appeal to the Western liberal sensibilities, so Vučić came up with this brilliant idea of appointing the first lesbian prime minister in Europe to lead the government for several years. She's still the Speaker of the National Parliament, and then you have this image of famously LGBT bashing Viktor Orban inspecting troops with the Serbian Prime Minister who comes from the community and they don't mind it because they have these other more economic, tangible areas of cooperation. Right, and with Russia, so the ties are deeper and precede the Vučić regime, the soft power of Russia and the control of the energy sector. I think a lot of it sort of can be traced in 2008 when Kosovo declared independence, and then Russia became a main ally of Serbian diplomacy trying to contest that independence. But under Vučić, the cooperation became much stronger in the security sector and also in the media. So Serbia became a home to Balkan or Serbian language editions of Russian state media. We broadcast not only in Serbia, but to the whole region. And also the intelligence services of the two countries have formed this joint working group to combat color revolutions, which essentially most of the visible activity seems to be Serbian intelligence services helping Russians police the Russian community in Serbia. A lot of people came after the war in February 2022, and if they try to organize against Putin or against the war, they are harassed by the Serbian intelligence services. Despite these close cooperations, this inconsistent support for Serbia, for Russian foreign policy, sometimes creates frustration in Moscow. So in a recent incident, a visible incident, there was a TV anchor in Russia who in a rant in one of his appearances declared Serbia to be the ultimate whore, double dealing with the West. And these incidents are damaging to the Serbian regime, which is why they employ, I list in the paper several examples of people with long-standing ties with Russia, going back Serbian nationals with ties to Russia from the 1990s, sort of cultivate relationships with different members of Russian establishment and the Russian illiberal civil society in order to preempt or to contain these damaging incidents. I'm doing really bad on time. Just very briefly, compared to the relations with these regimes in power, the relationships with the Western liberal actors are more sort of distant. And the one that the regime has particularly invested in is the relationship with the MAGA movement. Part of it is driven by diaspora, so the Serbian American nationalists who are Republicans and like Trump and try to canvass for votes of Serbian Americans. But a lot of it is about the regime seeing the opportunity to get access into the Trump's inner circle through various shady business deals. So just this morning, I saw the report that the Serbian ambassador to the United Nations was recalled because it became public knowledge that the state has been paying $17,000 a month to rent him an apartment in Trump Tower, even though the country also owns the apartments in the New York City that could serve for his condition. This is a way of basically buying access to the regime. And then the hardline liberal actors is that they try to craft these other liberal narratives onto these core patriotic taboos. Emphasizing the similarities between supposedly fate that Russia is facing, the troubles it has with the West being very anti-Russian, and then the 1990s was a sort of a test run for that, and that appeals to the Serbian nationalists. I mean, I can, in the paper and also in the presentation, I just like scratch the surface of a lot of these relations that are really diverse. And by coming back to the one of the points that someone raised earlier about the West dictating the agenda, I think there is some truth to it because of the prevalence of the English language and a lot of the influence of the American far right is immediate. So people watch Tucker Carlson, they watch InfoWars, and they cannot do the same with the Russian influences and Russian sources. So that's an interesting wrinkle to this story. I'm really rushing these things now, but I think the key takeaways are the liberal regimes are strategic about their language and their partners, but it doesn't prevent them from working together. Even these selectively liberal regimes create permissive environment for the more hardline activists. And final thought, I think I'm not quite sure about this, but I think the most of the Serbian liberal right networks, mostly the pro-Russian counterparts in Europe, in the United States, rather than with these Atlantist figures like Meloni or PIS, because I think, again, of the centrality of these memory wars about the 1990s to the Serbian liberal right, they find it difficult to branch out these more pro-Western field. Thank you, and sorry for running. Thanks, Pascal.
All right, 4 fantastic panelists, presentations, papers. We have about 20 minutes. I'm going to take chair's prerogative and ask 2 questions that can then percolate in your brains as we take some questions from the audience. I'll make sure we do mostly that. The first question is, in terms of all of your papers, we're talking about, especially about the EU, there's lots to talk about conditionality, influence. In your view, does liberalism rely on the total control and coordination of the EU to function properly? Is the case that when a Hungary goes the other way, suddenly liberalism starts failing in Europe or in these specific countries? Is this a fair characterization? Is this not? does liberalism need to be hegemonic in the EU for your particular cases? And second, I'd like to hear more about how your particular cases relate to moral cultural changes in the West. So, in certain cases, it seems quite clear that issues like anti-gender or migration or diversity or things like this are hot topics because there's been considerable change in Western European countries and North American countries on these issues. To what degree does the pace of change or the speed of change elsewhere in Brussels and France and the UK matter and explain or help us understand dynamics in the cases that you look at? So those are my sort of two big upper level questions, and I would like to have so a few questions from the audience, and then we'll go around and get some answers. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for all of your presentations. My question is for Anastasia.
Introduce yourself.
My name is Nick Castillo. I'm a program officer at the Caspian Policy Center. My question is for Anastasia on Georgia and in terms of the media market within Georgia. Do we see pro-Georgian Dream media using Hungary as an exemplar state in the way we were talking about earlier in the day on other issues aside from just EU expansion? So, for example, dovishness on the Russo-Ukrainian war. And that's an interesting one because on the one hand, they could use this EU member to legitimize their own dovish position on Russia-Ukraine. But on the other hand, that's not a particularly popular position with many Georgians. So that would sort of be the risk there. And then I had a second question for Lorena. I'm just curious about how people in your case studies conceptualize what exactly the West is, which is, I know is a very broad question because in countries like Georgia and Ukraine, I think liberals are often anti-Western, and then pro-liberals conceptualize the West as the exemplar and inherently liberal. And it seems like your case studies are kind of interesting because that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. And that's it.
Thank you so much for the panel. My name is Jule Schürmann. I study hegemonies of powers, the state of democracy, and political narratives at Freiburg University. And I have a question for both Lorena and Anastasia. So for me, I'm really interested in the EU governmental liberal response to all of this, and on the notion or the matter of the idea that the strategic interests kind of trump democratic accountability mechanisms in the sense. I was wondering if this is something you observe, generally speaking, as sort of security and stability and these notions taking precedence over democracy as a primary interest, which then would lead to the undermining of democratic tools and mechanisms. And also whether you would situate this kind of trend, if you do observe it, rather within the EPP and the current governmental forces in the EU Parliament or the conservatives in Europe in general, or whether you also observe this broadly speaking. I don't know if this is like your research focus, but in other parties and actors as well.
Take two more questions.
Thank you. Perrine Chir again from Rouen University in France. I have a question for Lorena. So my question is that you work on anti-gender arguments. And so my question is, usually I work mainly on the far right. And so for the conceptualization of the far right, the anti-gender and kind of traditional family argument is always seen as the other side of the coin of the nativism argument. So nativism basically defines like an identity to be defended, and then the traditional family argument is how that identity is reproduced. So this is for the far right, at least the far right conceptualization. Is it the same according to you for illiberalism and the illiberalism version of anti-gender ideology?
Yeah, sorry, because I had, I mean, it's very similar to the one already asked by the colleague to Lorena, because at some point you mentioned that during your interviews the notion of the West as a colonial sort of ideological imposing actor comes up, and I wanted to know if you could further elaborate on that. And also, I wanted to know to what extent do you think that your interviews have um, contributed to enlarge your subject of study, knowing that they are, let's say, legitimate actors that actually can express themselves on media or intellectual publications, and they do not necessarily come from grassroots movements or from places where their voices are less heard.
Let's do that round, and then we'll get another one. So I'd like to go first.
Could you just explain to me a little bit what you're asking in this last question, because I didn't catch it?
Like, if I had to do interviews to obtain certain data related to this course, I don't know if I choose to interview subjects that I already can read, whose speech I can access on media or intellectual publications, and I would rather try to interview people whose speech is not that easily accessible, basically, and to what extent that contributed to enlarge your subject of research. Sorry if I wasn't clear enough.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, there was a lot of questions, so maybe I should go from the back and try to go through most of them. So interviewing people who are less accessible, I'm not sure how you, what you're interested in hearing about how I structured my research, but I want to stress that I interviewed both people who are on the lower levels of these political parties and organizations. Usually it went in this direction that I first had contacts with someone who was somewhere in the grassroots element of it, and then they recommended me to someone who was a top level political elite, and then I would have conversations with them as well. So this was merely the nature of how snowballing interviews usually goes. It's that I had an entry point in some like structure of people, and then it kind of rolled over into interviewing more and more of different strata of society, I would say. So it was natural. Um, on the colonial imposition of Western values, I didn't talk about that a lot because there is quite a bit of literature that is directly analyzing these frames. So I could also point you to some of these. But the main narrative here is that original, and this comes basically to the other question as well of how this is related to the nation. The main narrative is that the true Croatian and Serbian people have always been only men and women are in a marriage. There is no abortion. There is no anything else. So therefore, this couldn't have been something that we would come up with. And the main reason that it is coming to our countries is because of globalization, because of the West, because they are somewhat imposing their values on our pure society. So this is the basic populist argument that you hear elsewhere and on the far right as well. There is, of course, many commonalities, and we can look at these actors also through the prism of far right, and I have done that as well. But it's just depending on the choice of here I wanted to stress the fact that they are very connected to liberalism and liberal institutions, and this is why I use the term illiberal specifically. And then how do I observe the stabilitocracy generally speaking? Is it only within the EPP or not? Also, this is a very elaborate literature that has been maybe one of the most important parts of analysis of the Western Balkans specifically. So I wouldn't know how much it extends to other cases, but whenever there has been any kind of research on Western influence in the Western Balkans, it always refers to this aspect, and it's very connected to the historical element of how the war was resolved somewhat in Bosnia specifically, let's say like that, but also in other countries. And then the influence that the US primarily also had in the independence of Kosovo and in other issues relating to this region. I would say that it is a relevant concept in analysis of many other things because I don't see a reason why this logic that stability is more important than democratic values would only adhere to the Western Balkans and not to other countries where there's political instability as well. But this is my expertise area, so this is what I can answer you. And how do people conceptualize what the West is? I didn't talk about how I conceptualize the West. This is also a little bit problematic, but people usually stress, and this is a question that I directly pose to them. People stress that they are the West. And this is the main answer that I always got. They said, we are the West, we are not against the West. It's a little bit more complicated in Serbia because some radical nationalists who I talk to will also stress that they are very anti-Western because of the NATO bombing in 1999. But a lot of them are trying to build a different West, and that is their agenda. They specifically said that they want to build a different West. And this kind of comes into what Orban is doing again and shows some level of diffusion of these frames and how to talk about what they're doing. Maybe I will leave.
So thanks for the questions. So I would like to maybe answer your very interesting and very important question regarding whether progress in other states, how does it influence kind of the narrative, the illiberal narrative, for instance, in Poland. So from the Polish perspective, I would say that it influences a lot. And how? Because progress, whether it is women's rights, whether it is acceptance, openness to different lifestyle choices, LGBTI rights, progressive vision of family, so the kind of the retreat from the traditional family concept, it allows illiberals within Poland to build something that they oppose to. So it is rather, and let's take the example of LGBTI rights and precisely the right to, for instance, to the protection and legal recognition of same-sex unions. 30 countries within the Council of Europe allow 20 countries within the countries of Europe allow same-sex marriages. 10 countries within the Council of Europe allow under a different legal regime same-sex unions, so a civil recognition under civil law. Poland has neither. So recently there have actually been two judgments of the European Court of Human Rights that finally, after so many years, said that it is a violation of the Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. So what I mean by that is that they really make of this lack of progress, they make a great argument. They really, that is something that they are proud of. And I think, yeah, this really opposition to the progress, at least from a Polish perspective, is something that is foundational for liberalism.
I will also go from the back up. The first question was about if we see the strategic interest triumphing over democracy in Georgia, and we definitely do. And especially before Georgia became openly liberal and openly authoritarian, there were so many cases of the European Union shutting its eyes on democratic violations to preserve stability. And I think an important argument that Florian Bieber and the stabilitocracy's argument makes is that this is a false sense of stability, because actually in Georgia's case, the government keeps saying that there is peace and they're guaranteeing peace, but every day there's the Russian border that keeps moving slowly and that people keep getting abducted. And if that's stability and if that's peace, then So definitely, for example, by giving Georgia candidate status when only 3 out of 12 criteria met, for example, after continuing to meet Georgian government officials at times when they were openly voicing anti-EU sentiments and paring down EU agreements, the government really used this to maintain this image of democratic and pro-EU. And this wasn't only because of Hungary, but also actually because of the European Union prioritizing stability or security over democracy in Georgia. About the media question, and if I saw Hungary used for other cases, yes, and that was very interesting because especially the narrative that the West is dragging us into war and that we want to avoid opening a second front. Orban's quotes were frequently used about peace and maintaining that. And not only Orban's, but interestingly, Trump is frequently referenced as well. And they create this easily accessible cards in the government channels that can be easily distributed and sort of like this West to get a legitimacy from Western sources that actually their narratives are not so far from theirs. Also, one interesting thing was that when the EU was applying this negative conditionality, they also had this quote of Macron saying that the EU is falling apart and will soon die. So that requires further research and could be very interesting indeed. And one, I will just briefly answer one of your questions because I think that was very interesting about if liberalism needs to be hegemonic in the European Union. And in my case, for example, Moldova and Ukraine's case shows that it doesn't because Hungary has not been able to block more liberal candidate states from progressing in the EU because they didn't have this anchor that they had with Georgia and because their veto powers were were blocked through bargaining. Like I don't know if you remember the incident where Scholz just asked Orban to get out of the room when they were voting if they should vote for EU accession. So not necessarily, I think, but yeah, in most cases.
Very briefly on your question about whether it needs to be hegemonic, I think we need to also remember that it's not only through conditionality that EU influences these countries, but also through, going back to Levitsky and very linkage and leverage. So in case of Serbia, for instance, 2/3 of Serbian exports and imports go to the European Union or come from the European Union. So the ways in which the West and liberal West can influence the internal political developments are, I think, much more diverse and subtle than just through these EU level negotiations. So in that respect, I think its influence, it needs to be hegemonic in the key capitals, in Paris, in Berlin, and Washington. We'll have elections here soon. I think the outcome of that will be more consequential for the development, the direction of travel of the regimes than whether Orban is able to block one or two decisions at the EU.
Excellent responses. We have run up on time, so I'm going to end this panel. I'm going to invite anyone who still has a question to please come up and ask the question to the panelists, who I'm sure can stay for a few more minutes. But regardless, thank you everyone for attending this first day of our conference on an illiberal transnational, and we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. All right, thank you very much.